Well, good. A lot of familiar faces here, so thank you very much for coming back. An occasional new familiar face, and so you're all very welcome. And to this rather fascinating but abstruse and yet obvious question about light. Now, what's curious about light, like many such things, is that everybody knows what it is until you ask them. Everybody knows what light, well, define light. The dictionary, I looked it up this morning, said, well, it's the medium for seeing, which is obvious enough, and it is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that radiates at a speed of 186,000 miles per second, which is, you know, only so informative. But there's a joke about a very distinguished physics professor who taught at a university. And one day he was walking across campus, and he saw a student that he'd had 2 or 3 years before. And he remembered the student very well because this student was the biggest dolt that had ever studied with him. He was obviously impressively dull. So the professor went up to him and thought he would ask a few questions. And he said, you remember me? Yeah, I remember you. Well, did you learn anything in my course? Well, yeah, some stuff. Well, for example, maybe you could tell me what electricity is. I forget. The professor shakes his head and said, the only man in the world who knew what electricity was, and he has forgotten. And so you come across very, very kind of a wall when you hit very obvious questions. And this question is going to have to do with, to some extent, the physical properties of light, although very, very little of that, but more the metaphysics of light. That is to say, meta, as you know, means beyond, and metaphysics, well, has lots of meanings. Here's one famous statement that you've all heard. Milton quotes it in Paradise Lost. God is light. And we come across statements like this, and we wonder what they are. What do they mean really? You could say exactly the same about God is love, which everybody says all the time. But that's another lecture. The favorite one these days is, of course, all is one. Everybody says that. All is one. What on earth does that mean? In the obvious sense, it's simply untrue, because I'm standing here talking and you're sitting there listening. So what sense are you talking about? Do you know in some way that this is the case? Or are you simply parroting it like something you read on a bubblegum wrapper? And these are always good questions to ask when this kind of New Age metaphysical platitude comes up. It's not that they're wrong, but they become kind of just another slogan that you're living by, you know, just like Coke is it or whatever. So let's look at this. Well, all right, God is light. Well, this could mean at least one of two things. Does God equal light? That is to say, well, there's light coming out. There's light coming out of the bulbs out there. If God is light, is God coming out of those bulbs there? Is that what we really mean? So is God to be identified with light? Or is it a kind of metaphor? A metaphor is, as you know, a like statement without the like. A beautiful woman is a flower. What a lovely poetic thing to say. If you say that, whether people think it's beautiful poetry or not, very few will understand you as meaning a beautiful woman equals a flower, or a beautiful woman is a species of flower. Nobody believes that. And you didn't mean it that way, unless you're an idiot. And so we find ourselves asking, is this God like light, or is God equal to light? This is there's a big problem with this verb is, which is in technical philosophical language called predication. And that too is another lecture. Here's a verse from the Sefer HaBahir, which means the Book of Illumination. This is the second oldest of all the Kabbalistic texts. It dates probably to the 11th century. And this is very close to the beginning. It quotes the Bible. One verse says, "And now they do not see light. It is brilliant," as in this, "in the skies, round about God in terrible majesty." Oh, by the way, this really means clouds, but that's we'll get to that. So, all right, we have this verse. And then it quotes this verse. Another verse, however, says, "He made darkness his hiding place." There's also written, "Cloud and gloom surround him." This is an apparent contradiction. Now, just as an aside about the matter of Jewish, Kabbalistic, and Talmudic exposition, this is how they worked it. One of these learned rabbis would go around and someone would say, "Well, there's this verse." And the other learned rabbi said, "Yeah, but what about that verse? It seems to mean the opposite. What do we do with that?" And then they come around and they dispute and come to some kind of conclusion or not. The conclusion is probably less important than, shall we say, the exercise of arguing and thinking about this, assuming it can be done without people hitting each other in the mouth. And here's its answer. Third verse comes and reconciles the two. "Even darkness is not dark to you. Night shines like day, light and darkness are the same." So the question is, what in kind of metaphysical sense is light versus darkness? And what does it have to do with us? Now here's a man who had an experience of light. And his name was Jakob Böhme. And he was a shoemaker in Germany in those years. And one day in the year 1600, he was, for some reason, just kind of staring at a gleam of light off a pewter dish. And he became fascinated by it. And he had a mystical awakening that made him one of the most influential mystics, certainly of the century and in all of Christianity. Here's how it's described by Richard Buck in his book Cosmic Consciousness, which I'm sure many of you have read. It reflected that he fell into ecstasy. I'm not going to read it, but he's looking at this light just from a pewter dish, right? This is a perfectly ordinary glint of light, just as you would see, off your car window or something like that. And he gazed at it, and it led him into a state of illumination. Now, this is an interesting thing. In fact, I would suggest you even do this sometime, because it is kind of fascinating. Just stare at a glint of light sometime. Say you're sitting at Starbucks, and you may as well distract yourself from the misfortune of having to drink Starbucks coffee by, say, looking at a glint of light, off the window, off the table, or off someone's computer. And it is actually quite enlightening. And I don't mean that as a pun, but it's almost as if light is kind of an aperture that you can see through to another world. When we're talking about physical light here still. And that obviously happened to Böhme. So what then is the relation between the light of God and physical light? Are they the same? Let's bring another text into it. This is the Cloud of Unknowing, text which a lot of you are familiar with. It was written 600 odd years ago, so the language is different. And he talks about darkness, I mean a lacking of knowing, as all of that thing that thou knowest not, or else that thou hast forgotten, it is dark to thee. For thou seest it not with thy goostly mental eye. And it is not clepid called a cloud of the air, but a cloud of unknowing. So we have to, and if you go back to the Bahir, remember it starts talking about the clouds, even the first verse, which is not terribly clearly translated in the version I gave you. This light is hidden in these clouds. Well, they're obviously not literally clouds, as this man is saying. Nobody knows who wrote this, by the way. Maybe it wasn't even a man. But there's something here that well, let's go on to this. This is the logical conclusion from what he's talking about. And again, I think many of you have read The Cloud of Unknowing, or at least parts of it. So there's God, and let us assume that God is light in some form. Is that there's us down here, you, the seeker, all of us, in kind of the world as we know it. And there's God, and there's something that's kind of in between God. And this is a cloud of some specification. I actually like to refer to it as a cloud of oblivion or obliviousness, because I think oblivion and obliviousness are the best words. I've had a discussion with John, who, as you know, is a former Buddhist abbot, about whether the Buddhist term avidya means obliviousness rather than ignorance, as it's usually translated. It's one of those unresolved conversations we had. But in any case, there's some measure of obliviousness here. There's something we are not seeing, right? And there's something there's here, and this is keeping us from seeing it. We don't know what it is. It's called obliviousness, darkness. Now, I'm going to go into the teachings of this man who is virtually unknown in the English-speaking world. His name is Henri Coton Alvar, and he was an alchemist. I don't know if you know this, but there are practicing alchemists still running around in the world today. I've met a couple of them. They are very rare in the United States, and I don't think they're much more common in Britain or the English-speaking world. But as far as I can see, the alchemical tradition is much more alive and kicking in France than it is in the English-speaking world. In fact, I think there's a lot in the French occult tradition that has an enormous amount of depth, an enormous amount of value that just simply never made it over here. It's never translated. The French, I don't think, translate a lot of American works and vice versa. Certainly plenty of people can read French, or at least some people can read French, and plenty of them can read English, but there always seems to be a kind of cloud of unknowing between them and us. So he wrote a book called Les Deux Lumières, which means the two lights. And he's calling something original light. I'll let you read this for yourself. So this is what he calls the original light, okay? Now, is this physical light? Well, let's consider this fact first. Spirit, which he equates with light, is the source of all possibilities, including the opposition of itself to itself. That is to say, if sometimes, and he calls it the pleroma, as you know, the Gnostics did, the fullness, everything in it is possible, even opposition to itself, even, maybe we could say, even obliviousness to itself. It is just one of the possibilities that is worked out of all the possibilities that are worked out. It's not unlike the theory of multiple worlds, which is fascinating many people these days, the idea that, well, each kind of decision point and each kind of person's moment kind of, in a sense, puts you in one world, and had you made the other decision, you would be in another world. And if I hadn't had a burrito, an hour ago, instead of having one, that would have a different chain of consequences that would, in a sense, create a different universe. If you didn't show up tonight, it would be the same, and so on, so on. So, but there is this possibility of opposition. And it's easy enough to equate this with evil, and it often is. I mean, he does equate it, and he does name it as, he equates it with Satan, and he also equates it with Ahura Mazda, the principle of darkness in Zoroastrianism. But this is not, shall we say, the Satanism of the Catholic Church or the latest occult film that's made to terrify teens out on dates. It is a principle of opposition that is a part of the manifestation. So it can create a kind of opposition. Certain points of space, which are of extremely strong extent from the point of view of the spirit of opposition, refuses to allow the light to penetrate. Again, we're talking about the light of God here, not the divine light, this abstract primordial light. We don't know how this relates to physical light yet. But if this spirit of opposition can operate, well, the spirit of opposition is not the absolute. So it is limited. So, in a sense, only in certain points of space, only in certain, shall we say, instances, can this be obscured. This is kind of the opposite of, the famous statement, the little points of 1,000 points of light. It's kind of 1,000 points of darkness. Well, how do these manifest in our world? Well, here's where we're going to get counterintuitive. These regions where the light does not penetrate are the size of the atom or the neutron, or still smaller regions devoid of light, where nothingness, the spirit of negation, rules exclusively. Well, he brings up the atom and the neutron for very specific reasons. And of course, there's submolecular particles that are smaller still. Because he's pretty much saying that is what we know as atoms and neutrons and particles still smaller. What these things are, again, is really quite fascinating, because they're just about as difficult to define as light or electricity as anything else. What is an atom made of? Well, it's made up of things like protons and neutrons and electrons. Well, what are those made of? Well, they're made of still smaller particles. Well, what are those particles still made of? Well, still smaller particles. Then there's, they found the Higgs boson, which supposedly explains everything, except somehow it didn't explain everything after all. So what do you got? I mean, you really have to ask yourself, even setting aside what I'm talking about here with conventional scientific theory, because if you keep going like this, you get into an infinite regress. We know the story about turtles all the way down. There's a lady who said, well, this is all the world is standing on a tortoise. And someone asked her, what does the tortoise stand on? She said, another tortoise. And then what does that tortoise stand on? And she says, another tortoise. I know what you're going to do, she says, but it's tortoises all the way down. And that's kind of, these particles either subdivide and subdivide and subdivide to the point where they only have an abstract existence, which is kind of what has happened, which leads to certain intellectual paradoxes that you can find out about if you open any explanation of quantum physics or quantum mechanics. Well, these things exist, but they don't really exist. They kind of exist. They exist if you look at them, but they don't exist if you look at them. As Heisenberg or somebody said, if you think you understand quantum physics, it means that you don't. I don't think the converse is true. I don't understand quantum physics, and it does not therefore follow that I do. But anyway, there are these small particles. Of course, if you stop with a particle, you get the atom as it was originally posited, right? Atomus in Greek, the term was invented by Democritus in the 5th century, is a little bit tiny particle that cannot be subdivided further, can't be cut up. Well, we could get down to that point, but then those would be the most mysterious things of all. Where do those things come from? That is kind of a scientific problem and to a certain extent an aside, but I think it's good to keep in mind that what we think of as obvious scientific answers that explain everything maybe don't explain everything after all. Maybe they explain things only well enough so that we can, make the lights work when we turn the electricity on, but maybe further explanations are a little bit harder to come by. So anyway, that is his conclusion. These little things, these little bits, that is the root of matter. Matter, as we speak, matter is non-light. Matter is where the light of God is impeded by this force of opposition. So, in a sense, every little speck that makes up you is a thing that's kind of blocking you from this alleged divine light. If you think that this is a total reversal of the way we normally think of things, yes, you're correct. As I say, this is counterintuitive. Even if it's not right, this kind of thing can be useful to think about because it does stretch the mind in certain ways. It does open up the mind to different possibilities. And as we said, if this divine light is, shall we say, the embodiment of all possibilities, it makes our minds somewhat closer to that, to just simply to contemplate possibilities rather than fixing on something and as the truth. And we all know where that leads. As Gurdjieff said, sooner or later it ends in people breaking one another's heads. And I don't know of many truer statements than that. So matter is non-light. So here's what we have. We've got this divine light here, and then we have the opposition, the darkness, symbolized by these little points, which are the particles, subatomic, subatomic, atomic, whatever you like, that make up the physical world. And that make up matter. And that is the world of physical light, according to Henri Coton-Alvar. And I think there's something to be said for this argument, as is obvious, because otherwise why would I be talking to you about it? There is this kind of real world, and in a sense we all know this. We all know that, there's something we're not seeing here. And it's not like some news secret that's being held from us, or some great, I personally believe, some great Illuminati conspirators trying to rule the world, although there may be such people. It's this obliviousness that we are in. The Bible says that Adam fell into a deep sleep. It never actually says he woke up. You could take that would cast a lot of light, as it were, on this subject, but I'm not going to go there this time. So, space devoid of the divine. This is what he calls the koilon. This is the void. Again, this is the complete opposite of what we normally think about. Because what we think of of the void, the emptiness, is where all these little particles of matter is not. He's saying exactly the opposite. That they are kind of spaces of nothing, or at least of obstruction of the divine light in the world of matter. And this is how far he takes it. The tree that were not riddled with the koilon, that is those specks of obliviousness, shall we say, it would not reflect the incidental physical light, and it would not be visible to my eyes. So again, we have this, what he calls incidental light, which is the light of the world we see, and this divine light, which is a light we don't see customarily, because as the Bahir says, it is hidden in the clouds. And what are the clouds? The clouds are the clouds of obliviousness. And we go back to this. This is another, I'm just repeating this because, again, this darkness is a lacking of knowing, this cloud of unknowing. That is the quote I had earlier. So you can look at it this way too. There's God, divine light. There's the cloud of knowing, unknowing, and the physical world. Now there's a lot to this, like this physical world. Well, is this physical world real or not? Well, of course it's real in one sense. Why is it real? Because the word real comes from the Latin res, meaning thing, and the real world is a world of things. On the other hand, there's a lot we're not seeing about this real world. In fact, this is another problem that science is hitting. It's basically a contradiction. Because science is telling us, after huge numbers of experiments, huge numbers of philosophical volumes written, that our cognition is radically limited by our sensory apparatus. That is to say, you can see this much of the electromagnetic spectrum, you can hear this much, there's a whole wider range that we only know because of instruments that we've invented, but we have no reason to believe, I would say, that what we can measure in our instruments constitutes the limit. They're just the limits of what we can measure. So, science is saying our cognition of the world through the senses and the mind that kind of somehow figures out what to do with the sensory input is very, very limited. But then it goes around and kind of acts as if this sensory information and what we conclude from it is the truth. And those are two completely contradictory positions. And I think science is going to face this in the 21st century. And a lot of people are going to notice this in the 21st century. It's going to have certain consequences. Would I like to be around to see it? Well, it would be nice to see science get a little bit of comeuppance for 2 centuries of arrogance. On the other hand, do I want to stand around and watch people like killing scientists and smashing labs? Maybe I don't, because that could well happen. As you well know, because it happened before. Anyway, what is the difference here between this physical sight and, shall we say, the divine light? Well, let's, very, very obvious, non-technical terms. There's the thing you're seeing. The funny tree that's probably alive, although it looks remarkably artificial, really very impressive for an object of nature. No, I think it's real. Anyway, shows what I know about nature. All right, I see that, right? There's my eye there, there's that object there, and I see it. I need light to see this, right? If I went over and turned off all the lights and closed the door, there was no light in the room, I would not see this, and neither would you. So it goes back to what the dictionary said. Light is a medium of vision. But that is not the light of God, or the divine light, as I'm positing it. Because it's either there or there's the possibility of seeing, and also the possibility of not seeing if there's none of this light stuff around. That is physical sight, and that's all as obvious as it can be. But when you are aware of something, you do not need an intermediary. That is to say, the minute you cognize something, the seeing is kind of the light also that sees. What do I mean by that? Well, think of an image. Think of a gray horse. You're suddenly aware of this image of the gray horse. You don't need any light, physical light, to see the gray horse. Just your thinking of it makes it there. There's not quite the same block between the mind and the object as there is with this. Let's say that these are the two kinds of light. Let's say that this is physical light, and this is, shall we say, what I've been calling the divine light, or the primordial light, or whatever you want to call it. If it exists and it is primordial, we must have some connection with it, even if it's kind of a thin and tenuous connection. And this may be how we experience it. As every last one of you knows, there are many, many different levels of consciousness. There are many different gradations of consciousness, many different objects of consciousness. Being aware of an image of a gray horse is not being like aware of that tree. They're similar but not the same. And here's how a traditional text expresses it. It may be difficult to read in the back. Oh, nobly, this is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Oh, nobly born, and this is a person who just died, right? This whole book, as many of you know, is being read to somebody who's just died. Now thou art experiencing the radiance of the clear light of pure reality. Recognize it. O nobly born, thy present intellect, consciousness, in real nature void, not formed into anything as regards characteristics or color, naturally void, they say it again, is the very reality, the all good. And here's another thing, hypothesis I throw out for your consideration. This kind of clear light is kind of paradoxical. Because if we think of light as looking like that, something that comes out of a bulb or the sun or what have you. But it's, in a way, is it clear? Well, I don't know, it kind of looks like something. But clear light is, in a sense, transparent. Why? Because it is both the light and, as it were, the seeing. Again, there are many different gradations of this. Our ordinary consciousness is one. All of the great traditions say there are many, many other layers, some of which are very, very difficult to have access to. I'm always kind of puzzled when people, all these people are always going around giving lectures on enlightenment. Not you, John, you're good. But I mean, there are a lot, what is it, they're telling you, these people are going around telling you what enlightenment is. Are you enlightened? No. Well, how on earth do you know what it is? I mean, that subject more than any, they're just like, that's something I will never speak on. Unless I were enlightened, but if I thought I was enlightened, it would probably be symptom number one that I wasn't. I really think this enlightenment is an experience far enough beyond so that one had better be very humble about talking about it. Sure, I can recite what all the books say about it, but you know what the relation between what the books say and what the thing is, pretty much any subject. There's some resemblance, but don't rest too much on it. But let's say that this is the clear light of pure reality. That is to say, it's reality that is not impeded by the little points of darkness. That may be what it is trying to say. And I believe this is the case. I feel very reluctant to say anything about Buddhism in the presence of John, but he's a tolerant, patient man. But I do remember these being three, according to Tibetan Buddhism. I do remember a Tibetan Lama saying this. So I don't know how the Theravada people see it. Mind is infinite. That is, it can go anywhere. Well, you can think of the next galaxy, and your mind can go to the next galaxy in thought without any impediment. It is empty, void, because it isn't an object in itself. The objects exist in it sort of the way fish and plants exist in an aquarium, right? It itself is empty, and it is cognizant, it is aware. And I think these are at least reasonable things to posit as characteristics of what I've been calling the divine light. Again, as you all know, all these traditions have an enormous amount of wisdom in them, and if you compare them in a careful way, they can cast a great deal of light on one another. If you're not doing it in a careful way, oh, well, X equals Y, teaching X equals teaching Y, and that's not always true. So how do you get past this? And again, here's another. If thou wilt stand and not fall, cease never in thine intent, but beat evermore on this cloud of unknowing that is betwixt thee and thee, God, with a sharp dart of longing love. Well, his advice, it is basically a type of meditative practice that he's talking about in this text, which I certainly would encourage you to read. There are modern English versions of it if the Middle English is a little bit funky for you. It's a kind of meditation instruction. And basically, I didn't put this up, but basically you use a kind of word like a meditation mantra, like God or love. Those are the two he mentions, I think. And you kind of use that to reorient yourself to beat on this cloud of unknowing. Now, if you're interested in what this is like experientially, there's a Catholic monk named Thomas Keating who attempted to revive this very practice and has taught it as centering prayer. It's widely taught. I've never done this particular practice myself. I've never done centering prayer. I have known people who said they've gotten good results from it and have it as their meditation practice. Anyway, that's one way he does it. But let's look a little bit more into the nature of the cloud. Because if you try to penetrate it, maybe, you're going to hit kind of a wall. May just be a cloud that you can walk through. You've all been through planes that sail through the clouds without any obstruction, but it might not feel like a cloud. And it might be, A Course in Miracles, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. There are, we could do a whole long seminar on just the Course in Miracles, but here's a quote from it. The circle of fear lies just below the level the body sees and seems to be the foundation on which the world is based. Here are all the illusions, all the twisted thoughts, all the insane attacks, the fury, the vengeance and betrayal that were made to keep the guilt in place so that the world would rise from it and keep it hidden. So if you go through this cloud enough, you may hit upon the circle of fear, which just lies just below the level the body sees, right? It is this kind of underpinning. And what is the circle of fear? Well, you've all experienced it, I think. I certainly have. Have you ever noticed that there's just kind of this feeling of kind of fear, just anxiety, that's kind of a background to your life? And this anxiety is very, very funny if you look at it, because it always seems to be about something. It always seems to be about your problems, your grievances. But suddenly, this problem is solved, and suddenly another one comes to take its place. And if you solve that, another one comes up to take its place. And this is kind of funny, because you have to start asking yourself, is my upset about these problems really about these problems? Or is it a manifestation of something else that I'm not seeing? Problems are real enough, but a problem generally has a concrete solution, which you can either do, or if you can do it, you do it. If you can't, well, better luck next time. It's just that. It's just a problem. My sink is stopped up. That's a problem. It can eat that kind of problem, by the way, and your experience may or may not bear this out, but if you have some kind of experience like your car doesn't start or something like that, it's a problem. And there are certain solutions for it, which you know perfectly well. But a lot of times this kind of problem triggers a kind of level of core fear, at least it does in me. This kind of anxiety. Oh my God. That way outstrips the actual problem. And that's what it's talking about when it talks about the circle of fear. If you touch it, I suggest it will feel really awful. And it will be like an experience of pure fear. But I mean pure fear. Fear in the kind of customary physical sense is not the same. It's not the same as a fight and flight response. If someone's attacking you, yeah, you get scared and run away. But this is kind of an objectless fear. In fact, as we've just shown, it's just lying there looking for objects to cling on to. And I think this says a great deal. This is a very psychologically sophisticated work, by the way, if any of you want to go into it. So here's what our chart again. You've got God, the circle of fear, and then there's these grievances, problems. We think they're the problem, and as we know, if only this were different, if only so-and-so wasn't such an asshole, if only I had $10,000 more here, if only. Well, in a way, this is all kind of true. But there's a point, again, at which you have to start asking yourself, well, is this just the circle of fear manifesting in whatever form it can latch onto? And I think those are good questions to ask. Oh, these grievances. Well, of course, they easily attach themselves to whichever band of politicians you happen to hate. You hate Band X politicians. If only they weren't there. If only they weren't there, things were great. If you're the people who like Band X politicians feel the same way about Band Y politicians. If only these nasty Band Y people weren't around, everything would be good. That is the way we, and I definitely include myself in this, customarily think. Yeah, sure it would. So there is this primordial circle of fear, which is a cloud of unknowing, a cloud of obliviousness that, shall we say, separates us from God or the divine light, if you wish. And then there are these grievances, which are kind of the manifestation of this, and which also kind of produces this fear. So what is the solution? Well, Here's one, or at least this points to one. This is again from A Course in Miracles. By which I think you could mean that if you took this whole body of grievances that you have, all these body of problems as you kind of experience them, some of them do have to be dealt with, of course, but taken as a mass, they're a little bit suspicious. And then, of course, there are the grievances you have about things you can do absolutely nothing about. I came up with the Facebook Serenity prayer. How does it go? Do nothing about the things you can do something about. Whine endlessly about the things you can't do anything about, and be enough of an idiot to be able to unable to tell the difference. And most of, if you look at your Facebook feed, unless you are, your Facebook friends are a lot more enlightened than mine are, that's pretty much it. It's just whining about things you can't have anything to do with. Problems nobody asked you to solve. But people genuinely get upset about this, right? If I were going to take that in another direction, and I think A Course in Miracles would agree, the ego is involved in this, because a lot of our grievances are, I have grievances, especially ones that don't concern you personally, have the hidden agenda of convincing yourself you're a good person. I'm a good person, so I must be upset about X, Y, and Z. Now think about it. Just think of, well, what good does it do to be upset? You know you're not going to do anything, zero, about the vast majority of the world's problems because you can't. No one can. If you can do anything at all, you can, okay, this is an area I think I can work on in which I can make some concrete contribution. It will, I believe, always be a very specific area, and it will always mean that there are all the things you just can't do anything about. Whereas worrying about the whole lot means you're not going to do anything about anything. So in that way, my grievances hide the light of the world in me. And well, then let go of your grievances. This is of course, more easily said than done. But it's worth working toward. One of the books I wrote was called The Deal, A Guide to Radical and Complete Forgiveness, and it's a very short book. It's a very practical attempt. How exactly do you do this? Again, that's another lecture, which I'm not going to go into here. But I think I will conclude with one thing, which is, if you start seeing all these grievances, not as your friends, but as the problem in themselves, you at least have a start. I'm upset about X, Y. This is a problem. This is getting in the way of my life, which it frequently does. And if you have some sense of that, I mean, it's in a sense kind of a recognition, a kind of light bulb type going off in your head. It's like, it doesn't mean you won't ever fall into them again, but you've really, shall we say, cut off their power source at least a little.
Thank you, Richard. This is fascinating. My question is about, you're talking about the properties of mind from, I think it was from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Infinite, void, and cognizant. And I'm having trouble with void and cognizant in the same space. It seems to me if it's a void, there's no cognition there. So I'm puzzled about that.
Well, I think that's largely because it's puzzling. And I agree. I mean, certain meditative practices are, and this is the Dzogchen tradition, which has gotten very fashionable in recent years, of calling kind of resting in pure awareness. So again, a way of experiencing this might be kind of imagine your mind as space, right? And these objects that exist, these thoughts, these perceptions, all these things kind of float in it. And mind, your mind, is not any of these things, just the way the water in the aquarium is not the fish or the plants or the junky little plastic toys. But they all exist in it. That is probably the best way I can, that's probably the best I can do to answer your question.
There's a question that just came through the internet. Is that core circle of fear you were discussing possibly related to what Gurdjieff expressed as feeding the moon, like a lunar digestive system of sorts?
Gurdjieff, I mean, I have to kind of explain Gurdjieff just to explain this question to you. Gurdjieff believed that the cosmos was this kind of enormous food chain, and that we are part of this, and that part of the existence of organic life on Earth. I'm not going to try to relate this to what I'm saying because it's completely different, so just put that here and put this here. Life on Earth exists to give off certain vibrations that feed the moon, because according to Gurdjieff, the moon is not a dead planet, but a planet that's awakening to be born, right? And we have to give off these vibrations. And we can give them off in two ways. One, by what he would call working on yourself, which is, shall we say, a spiritual practice. Or because you're working on yourself spiritually gives off these vibrations that feed the moon. So you're not only helping yourself, you're helping the cosmos. Well, the other way to get them is by death. And so if there's enough of a shortage of these vibrations coming from us, everybody goes crazy and starts killing each other. That is part of his explanation for war. Now, of course, the job is to relate all of this to what I just said. I wouldn't try to make too many explicit connections, but these things, let's at least go this far. Gurdjieff speaks of the sleep of man. That's one of his central ideas. We're going around in this kind of low-grade hypnotic stupor all the time. And whether that's more obvious now than it was in his day or not is a good question. But this stupor does consist of this, partly at least, of this whole band of fear, grievances. What is this fear? Well, according to the Course in Miracles, the Son of God, which is us, all of us together, sort of imagined what it would be like to be apart from God. And this idea was so terrifying that the Son of God became submerged in fear and felt guilty about killing God. This is all totally irrational. I mean, the insanity of this is frequently emphasized by the Course. It became guilty about killing God, so of course it became afraid of God's punishment. I don't think you have to think terribly long to see how well that fits in with an enormous number of religious phenomena that humans have manifested all along. You know, Freud's totem and taboo You know, the whole guilt about killing the primordial father. Well, it's not because, you know, these people, this tribe of apes way back when, the sons all got together and killed the father and took his wives, as Freud thought. But because of this much more countdown to goodness.
Can you really wait?
In any case, I think this circle of fear and these grievances could be equated to Gurdjieff's sleep of man in some sort of way, but the systems are very different. Again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It can be useful and insightful to compare and contrast these things, but if you have to, you know, establish linear equivalencies all along the bandwidth of all of them, it's going to be confusing and just to make mistakes. Or most likely, the whole thing will just become such a mess that you'll go off and become a sports fan or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
I have another question coming through the internet. A long one. Crystals are members of mineral kingdom that have evolved to become transparent and can transmit the light through their physical matter. People are attracted to crystals and gemstones. Difficult to form this into a question, but since the topic is light, do you have any comment that comes to you on these members of the mineral kingdom?
Okay. Let's just take the world we know, physical world, just to keep things simple. Think of it as like this continuum, you know, ranging from dense, solid matter to who's at the top, of course, us. If you're going to make the system, you might as well put yourself on the top. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable. But usually it's positive. Well, I don't have a diagram for this, obviously, because it's someone else's question, but, you know, generally there's us, then there's the living things, and then there's inanimate things, right? Well, let's assume that this is more of a continuum than a rigid caste hierarchy. That is to say, there is an element of consciousness of this divine light, even in apparently inanimate matter. I don't think I'm supposed to mention the name Alice Bailey here, but I will. She wrote a book called Consciousness of the Atom, and she quoted Edison, who said pretty much that in an interview. I mean, you know, look at all these things that these entities are doing. You need the atoms and whatnot, how they combine with each other. Do you mean that they do that without some measure of consciousness? So the point is that this consciousness is a continuum. And our breaking it down into animate and inanimate is, you know, it's a useful simplification, but let's not forget that it's a simplification. By this theory, crystals would be part of the mineral kingdom that, shall we say, have more consciousness than many other forms of rock. They are able to form themselves. They possess certain, not all, but certain of the properties that we associate with living things, like capacity to reproduce themselves under certain circumstances. So they would be, shall we say, very high manifestations of this. That's what I would say to that. And they are intelligent in the sense that they can pick up things and hold them. That is to say, yeah, there's some truth to the idea that if you hold a crystal with certain thoughts and intents, good or bad, somehow it will be imbued with it. This is probably true with almost any object, inanimate, but it's probably more true with crystals. And they can have powers of their own. You know, the thing about precious stones is, why are they so valuable? Why is anybody interested in them in the first place? Well, yeah, they're beautiful and they're rare, meaning if something is rare and beautiful, it's going to be expensive. But the original idea was that precious stones and jewels transmitted certain forces and were used for healing. And if they weren't used right, or you put too much of it on, it'd be like, too much of, too much of a dose of a laser treatment on, a tumor or something. It could hurt you. Where would you see this? Well, remember all those, you've heard all the, my sons were watching something like this only a couple of mornings ago about cursed objects. And of course, the most cursed objects are these huge jewels. Are they cursed? Well, maybe. But maybe also that, a diamond this size transmits energy of a certain kind in a certain way. That's just not good to be around. It's just not good for you. Things are going to go bad. The way as if you, slept with a lump of uranium under your pillow. There was I remember reading something by a Hindu Swami who said, women should never wear more than a total of 1 carat diamonds on their person at any one time, because otherwise it will make them hard. I think there are enough rich women in America that at least could stand as possible proofs of this. So anyway, yeah, they do have this kind of intelligence, and maybe they don't have the intelligence of a plant or an animal or whatever, but it is all part of a continuum, and that would certainly include crystals. Well, I know it's a lot. Yeah, I agree, this was kind of a lot of material to cover, and a lot of these lectures that I give, I'm fairly familiar with the material, and could do many of them in short order if it were absolutely necessary, but this was one I really had to think through a lot more, and that was partly why I chose it. So, well, anyway, thank you for listening to my experimental ideas.
Thank you so much, Richard.